about this, other than just its intrinsic importance for people doing philosophy, is that it holds out the possibility of a theory of ethics, because we are the most complex phenomenon that we know of on this planet. Now, there you may edge forward in your seat, ready to spring forward with some objection, but give me a moment here. Complexity is a tricky concept to define, first of all, to define mathematically or any other way. Norbert Wiener and some of those people spent some time on this. But intuitively, I think it's a pretty straightforward concept. The way I define complexity is density of connections. If point A has 16 connecting points, it is less complex than point B with 32 connecting points. That seems fairly clear. You would have an uphill battle to argue against that. Some weasel might, but who knows? I mean, hell, you can't get consensus on what time it is. But if nature is a novelty-conserving engine, if that's what nature treasures, then we are not the chance witnesses of an existential universe. We are, in fact, all God's children, in some sense. In other words, we represent the quintessent gathering together of novelty. We are more than mere matter. We are more than mere biology. We are more than mere aboriginal culture. We are all of those things, plus we are our technical, our skin of technical connections, our extruded culture, our fecal coral reef of transistors, resistors, transponders, databases, and transmission systems. All of that is superimposed on the organic. So suddenly, this message that has been relatively ignored by intellectuals for 500 years, the message of our importance in the divine plan gets a real... The puzzle then is, if we're the part of the universe where value has come to rest in the process of compressing complexity, then why is it that in practical terms we seem like a loaded gun held at the head of the planet? In other words, all other systems and processes seem to have been put at risk to achieve this thin and wavering spire of complexification that threatens to come down around our ears at any moment and send us back to the 14th century, if not the Stone Age, if we mismanage ourselves. Well, I think that we need to look at this process from the broadest possible perspective and try to decondition ourselves from the assumptions of science. Every theory has what I call a hard swallow. I mean, probably because every theory is horseshit in some sense. I mean, truth is known in silence. So if you're going out of that area, you should expect some rather peculiar blemishes on the enterprise. So every theory has a hard swallow. Science, their hard swallow is what's called the Big Bang. The idea that the universe sprang from nothing for no reason whatsoever in a single moment. That persuasive or not, it is the limit test for credulity. You understand what I mean? I mean, if you will believe that, what would you dig in your heels on? I mean, believe that, then my family has a bridge over the Hudson River that we are willing to let go for a song. And you could really get in on something good there. The Big Bang is completely improbable, utterly improbable. It is the most improbable of all improbabilities. So just remember that when the fascism of science is telling you that astrologers don't know what they're talking about and somebody else doesn't know what they're talking about. I mean, science has built a house of cards on worse than sand, quicksand. I would like to propose a completely different theory, which sounds, I know, far-fetched, but I think it answers certain problems that can't be reasonably dealt with otherwise. I would like to propose that the universe is headed toward a singularity. Not that it was born in a singularity and has been blasted outward with the unraveling of the laws of physics ever since, but rather the idea that the universe is not a purposeless explosion running down into entropy, but in fact, the universe is some kind of process that is running along fairly well-defined runnels, or what the British biologist C.H. Waddington called creodes. In other words, it is not, again, it is not a flat surface over which we are free to lurch and careen in some kind of random walk or parody of Brownian motion. It isn't that at all. It is a topology. It is a surface, a slalom, whose high walls confine us as we move deeper and deeper into the process of complexification. And we move into that process faster and faster and faster. And this is where it gets woo-woo, because I am, willing to say I'm convinced, anyway. I'm willing to say I'm convinced that history is the enunciation of the nearby presence of a transformational event. In other words, a planet without history is what you get if it's business as usual. The chipmunks dig their burrows, the hummingbirds fertilize the nectar, the trumpet flowers, the ants dig out the ground. Everything proceeds normally. History is what happens when an animal species has its genome distorted by the nearby presence of a transcendental object. It only lasts 12 to 1,500 generations. It's very brief in terms of the life of this. If the life of this planet were a city block, history would be as thick as a piece of typing paper. That's how long it lasts. And yet, this is all we've ever known. The inside of this transitory domain called history. And without thinking about it very much, our secular society tells us to assume it will go on forever. Assume it will go on forever. That's a bigger stretch than the Big Bang for me. I cannot see how anyone could assume that human history will go on not forever, but let's say as long as it has gone on. Can anyone imagine the next 10,000 years of technological development and global civilization? It's a joke. Can anyone imagine the next 1,000 years or 100 years? I think that the asymptotic curve of technological development, complexification, the spread of communication technologies, and yada, 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 is happening so fast that within our lifetimes, we can see the transcendental object rearing up and throwing the shadow of its enormous protean form across the surface of social processes and social evolution. The purpose of history is to create planetary crisis, and it's doing a splendid job of it. Apparently monkeys would rather kick back and chill, and so we've only functioned well under pressure, and so the pressure is rising. And, our responses have been astonishing. When the African continent dried up, we invented agriculture. When spoken language was insufficient, we invented alphabets. When they were insufficient, we invented mathematical modeling. When the complexity of the world exceeded our mathematical models, we built computational machinery to expand the power of our mathematical tools. We seem to function well under pressure, and now we are coming under pressure. I think that for a very long time, maybe, pick a number, but let's say 50,000 years, at least since language, shamans or users of hallucinogenic plants have had what Wordsworth called intimations of immortality. That aside from everything else which crowds the shamanic mind space, there is this view along the forward vector of time to this brilliant, boundary-dissolving light that seems to throw its influence across all processes that precede it. And religions, great religions that involve the faiths of hundreds of millions of people, are intimations of this transcendental object at the end of time. And they all get it wrong, of course. They get it wrong because it is always filtered through the vicissitudes of the historical moment and the political needs of those who are telling the tale. But if you take all of these things not as God's revealed truth, but more as God's image in the funhouse mirror of bent ideology, you can sort of extract out of all these images a sense of what the transcendental reality must be like. And I think, recurring to the idea that we are fractally organized, that we are microcosms of the larger structure of the universe, then I think in the natural phenomenon of orgasm and in the, the human-plant interaction occasioned by psychedelics, so orgasm and the psychedelic experience, we actually, in fractal form, anticipate this boundary-dissolving conclusion to the historical process. I mean, that's why Eros is like a compass of hope. Why everybody says, after the hortatory political breast-beating and all of that, everyone knows that what we really need is love, that without that, it won't work. With that, the political, social, intellectual, and technological details will probably take care of themselves. But love, in the heart of a monkey, which is what we are, is an effort to image this transcendental thing at the end of time. I mean, to love is to open to the presence of the other. And that's a very, very profound boundary dissolution. Ultimately, at death, I think probably the only way you can meet death fully in command of your faculties is to love it, to surrender to it. Well, we each can make whatever peace we can or cannot make with our own death, but we get much more agitated when we contemplate the death of the species or the death of the planet, because that seems to involve such higher stakes, such greater loss. What I observe in nature is nature is a very high-stakes gambler. You know, nature is like the good shepherd in the gospel story. I mean, she will leave the 99 to save the one that is lost. Her interest in complexity and her willingness to allow it to adumbrate in ourselves to such a to put every gray whale, dandelion, parakeet, and spotted owl on notice that the human enterprise is somehow an acceptable risk for them to endure. And I think that the way psychedelics play into all of this is they, by being boundary dissolving, by being deconditioning agents, they strip from your eyes this downer trip that we have inherited out of a scientific model of reality. We are not lost in a mute, uncaring, purposeless universe. How anybody could ever suppose this? It takes an extraordinary power of the denial of simple observation to come to this conclusion. Nevertheless, this is what modern science tells us, the death of the planet, because that seems to involve this. If this isn't obvious to you, then you probably need to do 5 grams in silent darkness on an empty stomach and just weigh the psychedelics play. It's a small number of items on the menu. Most of these items on the menu are simply ideologies. None, except for psychedelics, I would submit, are an experience, a direct experience. And this is what gives it a leg up. It's not an appeal to reason. It's not an appeal to reason. And in fact, it is ultimately unreasonable. You know, Tertullian, when he was asked about the resurrection, they said, you know, why do you believe in this? It's so stupid. And he said, credo te absurdum. I believe it because it is absurd. I believe it because it is absurd. This is a thoroughly modern sentiment. If the rest of the fathers of the early church had been as hip as that statement, we wouldn't have come away with original sin and the virgin birth. I believe that there is very little time left, that history is the enunciation of human morphogenetic transformation that is under the control of the largest control structures in the planetary ecology. In other words, it's not up to Bill Clinton or Skink Gingrich or any of these reptiles. It is not a matter of human decision. It is built into the dynamics of the planet. And consequently, all this Western breast-beating and blame-taking about what we did and how we fucked up and all this is a bunch of nonsense. Nobody screwed up. You have to have an enormous sense of your own self-importance to believe that you got away from the control of nature and against her wishes were able to set the planet up for Armageddon. I mean, it's such a typical Western fantasy of freedom and opportunity to do evil. History is not evil. It's misguided and messy and very redundant and iterative, but it isn't evil. For some reason, 12, 10, 15,000 years ago, the human family divided into 2 camps. the sacred, ritual, eternal, shamanic style of existence, which lived lightly on the land and was tribal and non-technologically based, and our style, which was a style of conquest and denial, virtual reality building. I mean, now this is thought to be the technological edge, but the earliest technology for virtual reality implementation was language, followed quickly by the hard wiring we call urbanization. You know, once you have an urban setting, you are walking around inside of virtual reality. This is an ideology that has been turned into matter. It's as virtual as anything could possibly be. There is nothing new about setting up symbols and taking them for truth. I mean, this seems to be our unique curse, as it were. What the psychedelics do is decondition us from all the media-induced ratios of perception and value systems, and then you just see that culture is just some story that a bunch of people got together. All culture. Doesn't matter whether you're rainforest pygmies or, you know, Japanese bankers or whoever you are. Your story is just some story that, you know, has a certain amount of drama, a certain amount of self-congratulation, a certain amount of risk, and it keeps thought away, that story. But if we dissolve our cultural story, then we discover, you know, what it is that we've been ignoring for 20,000 years, which is the nature of nature, that it preserves novelty, that it is an engine for the production of complexity, that this complexity extends from the abiotic realm into the biotic, into the cultural, into the technological, seamlessly, with no ontological break or transformation. Consciousness is a kind of omnidirectional threat detection and assessment system that a very paranoid and small monkey put in place in a grassland environment frequented by very large hunting cats. And so the purpose of consciousness is to inform you of something horrific about to happen, that in the hope that you can then take some action against it. But in the bottom of a cave, or high up in a tree, or on a small island, or somewhere where you feel safe, if you will then intoxicate yourself with psychedelics, the evolutionarily defined and paranoid threat detection configuration of consciousness breaks down, and you discover that you have an angel inside your head. And this angel is the non-paranoid, non-carnivorous monkey who is still, nevertheless, you. And that from this angelic point of perception, both the past and the future have an immediacy, a co-presence with the moment that they lack in ordinary experience. And I believe that as we create a non-paranoid world, a loving world, a world where people can operate in an atmosphere of trust of each other, that consciousness is slowly trying to relax and recast itself. And the grease for these skids is, of course, the psychedelic experience, because it forces this dissolving of cultural values. It catalyzes it. What it might take you 40 years to do through a process of rational analysis and psychotherapy and deconstruction and so forth and so on, it can happen literally overnight on a sufficiently alarming dose of a psychedelic substance. The reason I'm willing to speak to this is because I think it's not without reason that in this final moment of historical culmination, that our inventorying of the life and customs of this planet has brought to our attention then these Aboriginal practices, because they are the other half of the equation. What we have brought forward is little truths like energy equals mass times the velocity of light squared, so forth and so on. We are the masters of matter and energy, but not the masters of our own dreams, our own spiritual striving. For that, we are going to have to infuse our sense of technical accomplishment with the heart, basically. The heart that these Aboriginal cultures have kept intact.
Is not a big rock infested with living organisms any more than your skeleton is bones infested with cells. The Earth is geological, yes, but this geological entity grows people, and our existence on the Earth is a symptom of the solar system and its balances, as much as the solar system in turn is a symptom of our galaxy, and our galaxy in its turn is a symptom of the whole company of galaxies. So in describing my talking at the moment, I can't describe this just as a thing in itself, because I'm talking to you. And so what I'm doing at the moment is not completely described unless your being here is described also. So if that is necessary, if in other words, in order to describe my behavior, I have to describe your behavior and the behavior of the environment, it means that we've really got one system of behavior. That what I am involves what you are. But the problem is, you see, we haven't been taught to feel that way. The myths underlying our culture and underlying our common sense have not taught us to feel identical with the universe, but only parts of it, only in it, only confronting it, aliens. And we are, I think, quite urgently in need of coming to feel that we are the eternal universe.
What we need is a sense of unity, not an idea of unity, not an ideology of unity, because if there ever was an ideology of unity, it was communism, and the pieces are still falling from the explosion of that system of thought. We need a feeling of unity. So it doesn't come out of intellectual exhortation. It comes out of a personal act of courage made by the individual, an act of courage which involves surrender. Surrender is the opposite side of the coin of ego. The central issue of our times is our inability to surrender to what we know is right. We have the ability to feed the hungry. We have the ability to educate our children, to clean up our environment, to eliminate sexism, to eliminate racism. The question is, can we change our minds fast enough?
The hour is late. The clock is ticking. We will be judged very harshly if we fumble the ball. We are the inheritors of millions and millions of years of successfully lived lives and successful adaptations to changing conditions in the natural world. Now the challenge passes to us, the living, that the yet to be born may have a place to put their feet and a sky to walk under. Let's not whore ourselves to nitwit ideologies. Let's not give our control over to the least among